All right, if you would turn to Matthew chapter 9, and we'll be starting at the first of the chapter. If you remember, the last time we talked about Jesus casting out the devils out of the man there in the tombs, the cemetery there. I'm too tired to try to pronounce that word, but you know the story. And then cast the devils out of. He cast them out of that man. It appears as though there was two men. It says there was two possessed, and then he cast them into the swine there, the herd of swine. We also looked at where he had calmed the storm while him and his apostles were traveling. Him and his disciples are traveling. Tonight we're going to look at another healing that he performs, and Matthew, one of his apostles, is called, and we'll see how far we get. That may be as far as we get for tonight, but we'll see. In Matthew chapter 9, verse 1, he says, "And he entered into a ship and passed over and came into his own city." His own city. He's back where he grew up. In other words, where his parents had lived while he was growing up, and where he was known. And behold, they brought him a sick man of the palsy, lying on a bed, and Jesus seeing their faith, said unto the sick of the palsy, "Son, be of good cheer, thy sins be forgiven thee." Now, here's a man who's paralyzed. Don't know if it's from the neck down or the waist down. He's on a bed, lying on a bed, so we'd assume fully paralyzed. And Jesus says, they brought to him. In other words, those of the multitude that was following him, the people there, the people there in that city brought him, this man, to Jesus. And it says Jesus seeing their faith. In other words, he saw how faithful, how they believed that Jesus could heal this man. Where did that faith come from? Well, they had heard the stories, I'm sure, of his healing. Some may have even seen in person those healings. They believed Jesus could heal this man. And it's very possible that these people may have been saved people, children of God, and they believed in Christ already. They believed that he could perform his healing and that he was of God. Anyway, Jesus just simply says, "Son, be of good cheer. Be happy. Thy sins be forgiven thee." Now, we don't know a lot about this man, other than what we see here. But according to Jesus' words, it appears as though he has committed some sin, doesn't it? Of course, we know all men, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. But this man in particular, was his palsy a punishment from God because of his sins? We don't know. Jesus says, "Thy sins be forgiven thee." Well, if our sins are forgiven us, that means we're saved, right? And you notice this man, although the people brought him to Jesus, this man, as far as we know here, he didn't pray a sinner's prayer. He didn't ask for help. Although with him laying in the bed, it was pretty obvious he needed help. He's helpless. He couldn't. We don't even know if he could speak or not. It doesn't say. We just know that he's paralyzed, and he's having to rely on others to carry him around. And the other Gospels where this story is brought out, it says that there was so many people there in the house, they had to drop him down through the roof. They had to remove the tiles from the roof and drop him down through the roof. And it says, and behold, certain of the scribes said within themselves, this man blasphemeth. What do you mean, blasphemeth? Well, remember, in their eyes, God was the only one who could forgive sins. And that was a true fact. So, what's the problem here? Well, obviously, they don't have faith, do they? They're not believers. They're not children of God, at least not at this time. Maybe we don't know. Maybe some of them were saved later, but they accused Jesus of blasphemy. Accused him of being God, which he was. And they should have known that. They've heard this. Remember, these same scribes are the ones that have been persecuting him everywhere he goes. They know his answers to this. And Jesus, knowing their thoughts. Notice it says within themselves. In other words, they thought these things, not out loud. Maybe it was in their private thoughts. They didn't speak it. But Jesus, knowing their thoughts, he knew what they were thinking. And this right here should have opened their eyes, shouldn't it? If he knows how did he know what we were thinking? Wherefore think ye evil in your hearts? Why do you think I'm a blasphemous man? For whether it is easier to say, thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, arise and walk. Now, in a lot of the stories that we've read through so far in Matthew, and you go read the other Gospels, you see the same thing. Oftentimes, when somebody was paralyzed and couldn't walk, Jesus would simply say, arise and walk. What he's saying here is, what's the difference? Whether I say, thy sins be forgiven thee, or if I say, arise and walk. And what he's doing, it means the same thing. If you read these stories in their context, he's saying, it doesn't matter how I say it, they're healed, aren't they? If I tell a person to arise and walk, that means the same thing is their sins are forgiven now. How is that possible? And we think, well, our first thought is, wait a minute, that doesn't mean the same, but it does, because if you see the context of his healings, the stories of his healings, you see that the person that he oftentimes, well, I guess every time that we know of, when Jesus healed a person, they went off praising the Lord, didn't they? They were a new person. Not only were they healed physically, but they were healed spiritually. Remember the woman at the well. Remember the woman who was caught in adultery. Remember there were others who were paralyzed. Remember there were some that he would tell, go off praising God, but don't tell anybody what happened. And they did anyway. That's human nature. You're not going to stop people from telling, especially when you've been healed by the Son of God. That's going to be something hard to keep quiet, isn't it? But thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, arise and walk. He said, which one's easier? It doesn't matter. But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins. I'm the Son of God, he says. It don't matter. I have the authority and the power to forgive sins on this earth. Then saith he to the sick of the palsy. So he turns from the scribes and turns to the man who was sick. He says, arise, take up thy bed, and go into thine own house. You're healed. Go. And he arose and departed to his house. Did exactly what he was told. But when the multitude saw it, they marveled and glorified God, which had given such power unto men. They had not seen. If you go through and you read all these stories that are listed in the four Gospels of the miracles he performed, these people had not seen things like this, ever. Not in their lifetime. These were things that you didn't see very seldom at all in the Old Testament. There were some things in the Old Testament that were similar to what Jesus did, but not in this short a period of time, and as frequently as what he was doing them. The multitudes were beginning to understand. Notice it says, they marveled and glorified God. They worshiped. Because God had sent his Son with the power to do these things. Now, in the next few verses, or in the next verse, verse 9, we see this man Matthew. And Matthew, if you remember in Luke and in Mark and Luke, I can't remember in John, but in Mark and Luke for sure, they refer to him as Levi. Levi was his Jewish name. Remember, he was a tax collector, an employee of the Roman government. Although he was a Jew, some say that Matthew was his Roman or Greek name. And Jesus passed forth from thence. He saw a man named Matthew sitting at the receipt of custom. In other words, he was sitting at his desk collecting taxes, some form of tax. We don't know what it was. Maybe it might have been just a bridge toll or a road toll, or it might have been tax season, and he will sit up doing people's taxes, collecting. We don't know, but he was some kind of tax collector. And he saith unto him, Follow me. And he arose and followed him. No questions asked. You see these stories of these men that Christ calls, when he calls his apostles in the beginning, and even before he calls them, before he gives them the title apostle, they just get up and go with him. They leave everything behind. Now, here's a man who's collecting taxes for the Roman government. He just gets up and leaves. Now, certainly in his position, there would have been at least 2 guards with him, if not more, at his disposal anyway, in case someone came up and caused a scene about paying their taxes. The Romans would not have left him by himself, certainly, but he just gets up and walks away. And in our day and time, if a tax collector did that, he'd be in some big trouble, wouldn't he? And I would say it was probably in their day. Matthew is probably a wanted man now after this happens. And even if there's no money missing, if he left everything there like we assume he did, he didn't steal anything, still the authorities would have wanted him because of his position. Yet he leaves everything and goes and follows Christ. And we have so many today who are called by God, or say they are anyway, yet they don't want to go. They're making good money, or they're comfortable where they're at, and the Lord has, or at least they claim that the Lord has called them to preach or to teach or to be a missionary or whatever, and they refuse to go. And eventually, they'll either go or the Lord will make them miserable. One of the two. Verse 10 starts another story here, and it says, And it came to pass, as Jesus sat at meat in the house. Now, watch this, because we hear this taught differently today, and I don't know why, but especially from the religious world. I'm not necessarily talking about Baptists, but from the religious world, and we hear it from some Baptists too, but people take this out of context and they twist it around the way they want to hear it, they will think it means. But this is talking about Jesus eating with the publicans and sinners. And it came to pass, as Jesus sat at meat in the house. Notice, Jesus sat at meat in the house where he was visiting, the same house where he healed the paralyzed man in the beginning. And that was Jesus' practice. And we say, well, wait a minute, there was this deal about Matthew was thrown in here, but remember, he's still in the same city. We don't see any change there. And when he was in a place, visiting a city like this, he would go and stay at one house. And that's where he would go back every night, every evening. That's where he went back for his meals, for his rest, and all that. So that's why I say this is the same house. But he says, and it came to pass, as Jesus sat at meat in the house, behold, many publicans and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. He did not go to them. They came to him. You notice that? Oftentimes we hear this taught that, and it's out there, like I said, in the religious world, for some odd reason, they can't go to the Word of God and read it correctly. They say that, well, Jesus sat down with publicans and sinners. No, they sat down with him. He was already there. He didn't go to their place. They came to his. He didn't go to a bar and walk in and sit down and eat with these people. He didn't go to the local pub or the inn. He was in a house that belonged to some people he knew. It doesn't tell us who. And he sat down to eat, and while he's there eating, these other people came in and sat with him. Not just him, but with his disciples. His disciples are there also. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto his disciples, why eateth your master with publicans and sinners? Well, what was he going to do, throw them out? They hadn't done anything wrong, had they? They weren't causing a problem like the Pharisees and the scribes, were they? I think if the Pharisees and scribes had stepped in and sat down with him, he might have thrown them out just because of the way they acted. But these publicans and sinners peacefully came in and sat down, and that's how we should be. I know people who, and we probably all know people who, if they were put in a position like this, if they were there sitting down eating and a rough crowd come in, they'd have some choice words to say about it, wouldn't they? And maybe we have at times. Well, look at that person there. They're got tattoos all over, or they not dressed properly to be out in public, or they got long hair. A man who's got long hair, or a woman has no hair, or look at all their jewelry or all their makeup. We go to judging people right off when we first see them, and we got to stop and think. They're in a public place. They're not coming to our house, and even if they did come to our house, it wouldn't matter. But you can't judge people by how they're dressed or their lifestyle. When you're out in public, you may have those thoughts. It may be an opportunity to teach your family that this is not the way we act. But at the same time, we're told to love our enemies, right? Even if they're the enemies of God, we're still supposed to love them to a point, enough that we don't treat them wrongly. And of course, Jesus here, these people are publicans and sinners. They're obviously enemies of God. Yet, he sits down with them, or they sit down with him to eat a meal. But when Jesus heard that, he said unto them, They that be whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. In other words, if you're not sick, you don't go to the doctor, do you? You only go to the doctor when you're sick. These people, their very description of them, publicans and sinners, tells us that they needed a doctor. They needed a physician. They needed the great physician. They were sick, spiritually speaking. But go ye and learn what that meaneth. I will have mercy and not sacrifice, for I am not come to call the righteous, but the sinners to repentance. The scribes and the Pharisees considered themselves righteous, didn't they? Were they? Well, we know certainly not. But it's like when we go out in the world and we come across people who are not saved. People, or at least we think are not saved. Or maybe, and we come across someone who we know we will feel for certain is saved. We're not going to go out and preach the gospel to everybody that's already saved, are we? We may do it in the church setting to remind each other. We may even talk about when we have fellowship with someone on a personal basis. We may even talk about our salvation experience or the gospel as a reminder or as a way of glorifying the Lord. There's nothing wrong with that. But Jesus looked at this as an opportunity to preach the gospel to these publicans and sinners. But why? Because they needed it. Oftentimes, we forget that. By simply, especially if you're out to eat somewhere, in a restaurant, oftentimes people are ridiculed for it, but what greater witness is there than to stop and pray with your family before you eat? Most people know what that is. Now, the younger generation, maybe not. But most people know when they see somebody with their head bowed and their food in front of them, or maybe they're waiting on their food, they know what they're doing. Even if they're lost, they know what they're doing. And again, the Lord can use that as a witnessing tool. It may strike up a conversation. I've seen people, especially older generation people, go up to a couple that had prayed over their food, go up and thank them for being bold and doing that in public. We should encourage each other in those matters. Now we're going to stop there for tonight. I don't want to get into the next part of this lesson till we have more time. And hopefully next time we'll try to finish the chapter. But just know, these stories that we read of Christ during his earthly ministry, like the one we just read about the publicans and sinners, it's so misrepresented today. You have people who try to argue that, he went into a bar somewhere and sat down and ate with publicans and sinners. Well, no, that's not what he did, and that's not what we're to do. We're not to. There's that thing. Not to. The appearance of evil. It's not. I don't believe it's our duty to do those things. Now, I've known preachers who did those things, that would walk into a bar and preach, but they didn't sit down and eat with them. They went in and preached the gospel to them. That's a little different matter. In this case, these people came to Christ, sat down with him at a meal, and what did they, even the tradition back then the same as it is now, what do they do? What do we do when we sit down at a meal? We sit and talk, don't we? About the things of the day, or whatever's on our mind. What do you think was on Jesus' mind when these people sat down? You don't think he preached to them? I'm sure he did. And with them coming in and knowing who he was, or knowing, at least thinking they know who he was, sat down with him. They may have had questions for him, and it gave him opportunity to answer their questions from a biblical standpoint. We don't know any more about these people. Were any of them saved eventually? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But the opportunity was there. And do we always take the opportunity? We need to think about that. I know there's places, especially if you go to a small mom and pop restaurant in this area, a lot of times the tables are very close together. And total strangers, we've had total strangers just, ask questions sometimes. And you know, whether it's about the restaurant, hey, what's good on the menu, if it's their first time there or something, or, sometimes they'll ask where you're from, and that opens up a good opportunity. Well, I pastor a church. And usually, well, not usually, but a lot of times, oh, that's nice, and they turn around and don't talk to you anymore. But that ends a lot of conversations sometimes. But there are times where people, oh, yeah, I know about that church. I went there when I was a kid, and that gives you an opportunity to say, well, where are you now? Well, and they're still not here. So you wonder how faithful they were when they were a kid. So anyway, we'll stop there for tonight and pick up with verse 14 now.